And welcome back to Love Kills by Hank Harrison, The Assassination of Kurt Cobain, read to you by yours truly, Bradley Dahlberg. And this is 2024, we're knocking this out. About 6 chapters a night I'm trying to read. I don't know I'm going to be able to keep up this steam once the chapters start to spread out and become more big, but we're knocking this book out as quick as we can. There's, let's see here, 65 pages of this book, and we are down to 300 left. Well, 304. So we got 60 pages done. We are now up to chapter 11. And it is Love Child. No matter how many times she was told she was loved, there was no recognition that the proof was in the abandonment. Marcus Zusak, the book thief. I was in graduate school in psychology at San Francisco State and working as a night counselor at a juvenile hall when Linda and I filed for what was supposed to be an amicable divorce. Linda was not yet in college. She was only contemplating classes at the University of San Francisco. As a part of the psych program, I was working with concepts of crisis intervention and was beginning to rescue people from bad acid trips, as well as hanging out with a bunch of starving rock musicians who turned out to be the Grateful Dead. Who knew? As everybody now knows, the rock scene as the city changed things radically. It grew out of the beat scene, and I was in the freaking middle of it. After 3 years of social work, a stint with several rock bands, a form of social work itself, and a few graduate school courses, I decided I wanted to be a writer. I was more or less dropped out after that, but Courtney remained the light of my life. At no time was she exposed to drugs. I wasn't surprised when Courtney started acting like a genius as a baby, as I stood resolved to make sure she came out with 0 scars. In this I failed, but I did manage to enrich her childhood sufficiently to give her the courage and the motivation to face all problems she might encounter as a gifted adult. Unfortunately, Linda didn't understand Courtney's giftedness, or mine, or her own for that matter. She didn't know who her real mother was. 30 years later, she discovered that her biological mother was none other than Paula Fox, a Pulitzer Prize winner and supremely gifted woman. But at the time, how could she understand Courtney? The baby was speaking sentences and reading the road signs while still in diapers. It's a common story in my family. But Linda adopted by decidedly ungifted parents, and I thought I was giving Courtney too much. Too much attention. The adoptive grandparents took a Spanish Inquisitional approach of the child rearing. By the way, the Inquisition was conducted by the Dominicans. In spite of disdain for the opposition, I tried to enrich Courtney's learning curve as much as possible. Almost before she could walk, my dad and I, both certified Red Cross water safety instructors, gave her swimming lessons. Ironically, like a baby boy depicted on the cover of Nirvana's album, she took to water like a dolphin. Not only was she smart, she was athletic, a potential Olympic medalist like her grandfather. My dad ran a similar program for underprivileged families in Oakland and knew exactly what he was doing. He was so amazed at Courtney's natural coordination, he used to use the phrase athletically gifted to describe her. In addition to the swimming lessons, everyone in the family began conversing with her peer-to-peer basis. No goo-goo. In every case, I emphasized the symbolism or creative freedom I tried to often realistically, possibly, to let her know that she was special and a creative freedom is a privilege. Linda didn't like it, but at least she agreed to not speak excessively baby talk to the kid once she moved out of infancy. Stressing vowels and speaking as instinctive emotional style is good for the tots. Courtney's processing ability was growing at a remarkable rate, and I didn't even want to interfere. To repeat, Linda and her family didn't believe in Courtney's giftedness. Her friends figured I was just fawning over a kid like Proud Papa, in spite of the risky persistence in the Baba Wa dialect, their other obnoxious dependencies on tobacco and booze. I spoke to Courtney above average standards for her age and made sure she got good food. Polyvisol liquid baby vitamins, and everything else. I never smoked tobacco or drank hard booze, so it was a conflict from the beginning. Was she smart? Oh yeah. On one occasion, while in the car, 3-year-old Courtney pointed out one of the gauges on the dashboard, Mercedes 190 SL, and said, "Clock," looking up at me as she pointed as if it was a question. "Is this a clock?" I pointed to the real clock, but I could see from her facial expressions that she already knew the difference between a time clock and a gauge. "No, it's a tachometer," I answered. "Oh," she sat in silence and looked at how the needle zooms around, listening to the exhaust pulse. I could also see her correlating the needle with the exhaust warp, thinking about variables. "Tach?" she asked. I was amazed she had already abbreviated the word. This could have been a coincidence, so I answered her in more detail. "Yes, it means the motor's speed." She grew excited and seemed worried. Show me, show me." She threw out rudimentary pun in the form of a question. "Tack talk?" Feeling like it was just more love for my own kid, I felt like Mozart was sitting in the bucket seat next to me. Little girl Tate was here with us. A sense of an abandonment and emptiness came over me. Oh, I thought to myself, if this kid is that gifted, what are we going to do? She fidgeted on her own seat until I stopped the car, and I had to carry her out to the front of the car, pop the bonnet, explain everything about the motor. She finally said, "Vroom, vroom," and I laughed. I pointed to the radiator and said, "Hot, hot?" She said, nodding that she understood, and then she grew tired of the tour and dismissed the whole deal in a matter of seconds. Go, let's go." She got it. A few weeks later, she wanted a kitten, so we drove to the Postra Hill and the SPCA. Her favorite tune in those days was "What's New, Pussycat? Whoa, whoa, whoa," by Tom Jones. When we got the kitten home, I asked her what she wanted to call it, and she wanted to call it "What's New," she said with a grin and shaking her head. "How do you spell that?" I asked. I handed her a crayon and a writing tablet, urging her to draw out one of the kitten's names, and she thought for a while and took a few trial scribbles, and then returned the tablet to me with the kitten's name scrawled across the page in purple and orange letters. Wikidis. Wikidis? She grinned and looked at me for approval. I almost fell down when I saw the paper. Courtney had written "What's New" in clearly legible letters. Coincidence? I doubt it. She was spelling photonically and punning at age 3. One day, Courtney purposely put her finger in the file cabinet at my office and began to close the drawer by backing into it. I caught her and hugged her, but that's when I started to worry. How could a 3-year-old kid be self-destructive? Easy. Even at 3, kids blame themselves for their parents' mistakes. Courtney knew she was divorcing. We were divorcing. She knew I didn't live in the house anymore. She knew I lived with someone else. Her worldly pain became obvious. The flaws in the emerald were already beginning to show. That's when I realized it takes a virtual army of supportive people to take a gifted kid unscathed into adulthood. Color me guilty. What did we do wrong? Everything and nothing. I picked her up every time she cried, no matter what, and pretty soon she stopped crying. Linda and her very old-fashioned non-Spock parents didn't believe in this. Linda insisted I let her alone when she cried. The Jesuit doctrine on child-rearing, severe isolation, was the only way to raise a child. Let them cry themselves to sleep. When she went to visit Reese, she cried herself to sleep, thus forming an intermediate conflict. Could this be the basis for 2 personalities? I said, forget it. It doesn't work. Isolation does not prepare a child for her urban crisis that she will inherit from us. The fundamental value schism was right there on the table. It disturbed everyone in Linda's family's peer group that I found ways to treat Courtney as an equal, asking her opinion, giving her choices at a very early age, and I wanted her to be the facilitator, not the dictator. We read books together. Moreover, we wrote books together. Until recently, I harbored a dream that Courtney and I would someday again write books together. Some people are afraid of books. Many people read and collect books. But in my mom's family, making them is a tradition, a hobby, like working a crossword puzzle or stamp collecting. Books, 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 books. Everywhere books. the most sacred relics in the house, besides the jasperware Wedgwood. Courtney's bipolar cycle grew obviously early on. Serenity was often followed by a seemingly motiveless temper tantrum, and I noticed that. Unlike most children who throw tantrums, Courtney was crafting those episodes to gain control of the adult world, the Victorians who have called her the willful child. The first temper tantrum she ever threw at all took me to a place just before Christmas in 1968 in front of Gump's window. In those days, viewing, or rather gawking, at Gump's holiday displays tended to raise your spirits and wipe away the blues. Gump's display, when it was owned by Gump family, was like the FAO Schwartz window in New York. But Gump's might feature a giant Buddha surrounded by elves in the Golden Gate Bridge, with fully operating mechanical toy cars and scale model ships, doll people on the deck, and everything moved in a fine animation. It was also real San Francisco stuff, not just toys. The resulting effect was awe-inspiring, and the panorama stretched around the whole store, not just one window, but also down the post and around the corner. To achieve this gestalt, and the entire Gump staff devoted themselves to the installation, leaving hardly any time for customers. I thought that Courtney would enjoy it. I looked forward to seeing her eyes light up instead of overjoyed it. When the store closed, she didn't want to leave. Finally, I bribed her, and we managed to get out without a trauma. I had no idea she was overstimulated. It was a freezing nippy outside, and I figured Linda would worry. Getting her outside was one thing, but prying her away from the window display was something else. She hadn't seen that yet. Another session of freezing and explaining how each elf worked and took another hour in a fog-laced wind forced me to drag her away in tears. She taught me. It was almost as if gifted kids will tell you they want you to teach them. They get bratty if you don't do the things a certain way, because their brains are structured already. Children like Courtney are not born tabula rasa. When she didn't understand something, she would just stop me and ask me about it. No silly question like, what makes the clouds? Linda, following the lead of her church, used to dictate strategy. Didactic strategy. I remember clearly explaining things to Courtney and feeling that my words were being absorbed into a fine agon sponge, and those days were numbered. The family priest did not want me loading the sponge with pagan symbolism. He failed, I won, but later on, the stuff got distorted in the mix. The night we returned to Gump's, she was still cranky. Kids are like horses. You do not want to ride them hard and put them up wet. But our time together was too short. We bonded a little more. I loved her too much, that's all. Wait a minute. How can you love your kid too much? Before Courtney was born, I developed techniques to bring people down from bad LSD trips based on suicide prevention protocols. I was the first person in the world to develop a rescue system for the particular class of drugs and psychedelic overdoses in general. I was never opposed to a certain qualified people taking it and thought it did too much more good than harm. But in large doses taken in awful settings, the most uniformed people and rock festivals, it proved to be dangerous, and I stated publicly that it should never be given to kids. This visionary attitude landed me on the front page of New York Times and netted an article in Newsweek. It had drawn on me that most people thought of LSD as a hell of a world drug. Nobody thought you could be rescued from it, and all trips were bad trips. And I still got funding and went on ahead with the project, and in weeks became the world's first psychedelic ambulance driver. The story was so hot. Cover versions appeared in the New Call Bulletin and San Francisco Chronicle and the Examiner every day. I lectured constantly and appeared on the national television and radio. The project carried a pilot grant sponsored by Al Dale, a radical Methodist minister, and Alan Skite from Chicago, and John Jones, another radical minister, who did a stint at the Champlain of San Quentin after that, and after seeing me walking Courtney around the Haight-Ashbury on my shoulders on the way to the museum with my brothers, Linda's family resolved to take the baby away. By the time Courtney was 4, my drug rescue intervention techniques were pretty much all proven, and all others had taken over. I was only able to see Courtney on weekends, but we still had fun together. Jerry Ganter and I were going to get married. She was a class act. We raised champion Samoyeds and went to the opera and Joffrey in the Surf Theater to see the samurai movies. In 400 Blows, Courtney fell in love with the sire. Basho, a gentle white giant stud dog with the black and bisque points. Basho slept at the foot of her bed when she stayed over at the 1460 Masonic, and one of us was always watched over her. At no time was she underguarded or left alone in the house. At no time did she get the night willies. We had a nice house, a huge Maybach Mach two-door, and sadly, the only time that I was allowed to see Courtney was when Linda needed a babysitter. This made the schedule hard to keep, but if I was ever once said no, I knew that what would happen. I repeat, Jerry Ganter loved Courtney, even when she was a handful. It was hard for the girl fresh out of college to love a stepdaughter, but Jerry did. When Jackie Rissy, Linda's adoptive father, fell on the Powell Street on the way to his office, things took for a downturn. As soon as Linda remarried, her second husband, Frank Rodriguez, took over, and Courtney grew alienated from me. At first, I had no idea why. It was only years later I learned that they were brainwashing her. According to the priests and the nuns who snuck in to investigate at Courtney's family gatherings, Courtney was becoming a wild pagan child, exactly what she turned out to be anyway. It was my fault, they said. Another no-no and all that austere pious. To the Buddha and to the manifestation of the devil, Linda had a coterie of maids in waiting. At the end of the chain stood Delnan Windblade, Linda's boon companion, the late Judy Carroll. To assure constant attention, second strangers would vie to see who could tell the most saculous tales. These girls were trained by nuns, so you can imagine the mindset. Kathy Casey was probably the most compliant in the less intelligent parts of Kathy's head. I had given a kid acid. What other explanation could there be? It was magic, and Linda didn't believe in magic. I always knew that Jackie Rissy, Courtney's geriatric adoptive grandfather, was manipulating events from behind the scenes. He liked doing that. He was, after all, Sicilian, but whatever. They were doing things that they didn't want me to know about. I was showing off the baby to my extended family in Pittsburgh, but Delancey cousins, who taught me how to dance, the jitterbug, were overjoyed. But to the Reese's, I had kidnapped their treasure. At the time, I had no idea they had already been abusing or using the baby for a hedge fund worth millions. Years went by. We all moved out of San Francisco, and Linda divorced Frank in the Oregon, married Dave Manili, and ran away to New Zealand, placing Courtney in several foster homes in the process, at least one in California. But throughout all of that, she continued to keep me from seeing my kid. Now I know why. She was too embarrassed, and the money was still in Courtney's name. Big money. Frank, in turn, remarried Courtney's 2.5 sisters with him. Taking Courtney's 2.5 sisters with him. Courtney's moved in with Frank for a while, but started to lose focus. Less than 2 years later, about 1973, she was 7 or 8. Courtney had her first crazy spell. I learned about this from my sister Kathy and my mom, who remained in touch, at least until Linda vanished. The word was Courtney was going through a behavior modification therapy. My sister thought it would be all right, but I freaked. This really pissed me off, because I hated behaviorisms. You can't imagine how this news depressed me. Mia died in the wool, Zen, Rogarian, Jungian. But not only was my kid gone, she was gone in the Watsonian enemy. Worse, this mind manipulation shit didn't work. It was supposed to save her, instead it messed her up. Courtney was giving mind-altering drugs in Portland as a part of the therapy known as reparenting. When she was 10 years old, accusing me of giving Courtney drugs worked throughout suspicion of a child abuse for a while. I was outraged that Linda would let Courtney go crazy rather than send her back to my family. The pain at this point almost broke me. I knew the kid was suffering too. I was shut out and shutting down. I started dressing sloppy, where I used to polish my shoes and shave every day, and I began decades of self-doubt. The summer of love had no love in it for me. I didn't learn how bad things were until I saw Courtney again in 1979 when she was 14 years old. I was hoping to be her white knight. Flashback to early spring 1966. After JFK was assassinated, we realized Linda's right-wing father was happy about it. We decided to take the baby back east, where I had a job offer in a small startup publishing company. I saved up about $1,000, which was a huge amount of money at the time. We went down to an auto delivery agency, got a New York car, and just took off. We told everybody it was going to be a vacation, and that was a part of the trip to take us through the South, where we could check into a civil rights movement firsthand. Linda got the sit-in bug when we joined Alinsky's famous sleep-in at the Sheraton Palace, a training exercise for radicals. I was cool, but she decided to sit down in front of the cops and got tossed in the paddy wagon with all the other demonstrators. You can imagine how that went over at the Reese's Perched, as they were there in the penthouse of the Taylor Street Tower overlooking the entire Bay Area. In a typical paradox, Linda was the only one arrested in the orange Rudy geriatric frock purchased at I. Megan, naturally, the Reese's, blamed all of this on me. In fact, at the time, Linda was far more radical and very pissed off about the JFK assassination, so we took off for New York. This is the end of Chapter 11. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and check out this entire book as we reach its entirety throughout the next coming months. This is Bradley Dahlberg, read to you in 2024. I appreciate anybody's comments, likes, shares, and subscribes.